Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. This is Mike Jones again. Professor Jones, Professor Mike, Mike Jones, physical therapist, uh, teaching at Grand Rapids Community College. This is Biology 121, first semester of Anatomy and Physiology. Back at you again today with Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is, let me put this on the big screen. Chapter 5 is all about tissues. Now, tissues have a specific definition in physiology. Let me show you. In fact, there are no more and no less than four tissue types. Every single thing, every single cellular type in the body can be defined or falls into one of these categories. Four, that's it, four. I want to emphasize that. There are many times when questions are presented to anatomy and physiology students early on, as you are in the first semester. These questions are presented to you as name the tissue. There are only four tissue types. Now, we're going to get into specific organs, specific organ systems. We're going to get into specific functions, blah, 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 all that stuff. When I ask you the question, and I emphasize this for a specific reason, because there are so many times when the question is asked about what is this tissue type. If I ask you about the tissue type, one of these four must be your answer. You have epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissues, nervous tissues. Most of the organs, I would venture to say all, but I'll say most of the organs in your body contain all of these tissues. There may be a predominant tissue that is found most, but most organs contain a variety of all of these tissues. And that's how organs work, and we'll see that in a minute. But tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, nervous, that is it. Now, of course, each of these tissues has their own subtypes and their own categorizations and their own ways of being defined. Yes, we're going to get into that. All right, I think I beat a dead horse there. Let's move on. Now, your text has a great picture. This is a picture right out of your textbook. This summarizes the major characteristics of these four tissue types. Understand, as I said just a minute ago, understand that the tissue types have subcategories, and we will go into each of those subcategories deeper and deeper and deeper. But these four tissue types: the epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissue, nervous tissue. That's it. These are the composition of those, of the kind of cells that are a part of those tissues, the functions of these tissues, and these subtypes, and there are lots of subtypes. We love charts. Charts are a nice, easy way to summarize dense information into a very short form. I like to mention when we're live, when we're one-on-one, I like to mention that you should print this off, put it under your pillow, hopefully that it will diffuse into your brain, or if you prefer, tattoo it on your forearm so that you will never forget this information. And we'll go through all of these characteristics, the functions, the locations, the distinguishing characteristics, but this is short form, shorthand for you to refer back to. All right, this part we've already been through. We've already talked about intercellular junctions. Now, each of the tissue types, any of these tissue types may have any of these intercellular junctions. And remember, intercellular means between cells. So in between cells, depending on what their function is, or what they're trying to do, what that tissue is trying to do, they may have any of these intercellular junctions. We've been through this before. You can review this on the last lecture video that I put up. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but there are only three types: tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. Remember, desmosomes and tight junctions are ways to adhere cells to each other in various forms. Gap junctions, yes, there is some adherence, but it is the only one of the three that allows communication, allows ions or other molecules to travel from one cell to another cell. Come on, change slides. There we go. And again, the table that you may print and put under your pillow at night or tattoo on your forearm. Okay, epithelial. This is the first type of tissues. Epithelial cells are extremely important. They have this characteristic. One of the characteristics is they do not have blood vessels. Blood does not travel directly to epithelial tissue. We're going to learn that blood supply is essential for bringing oxygen, bringing nutrition to tissues, and taking away waste products from tissues. And you're going to say, well, wait a minute. Epithelial tissues don't have that. How do they get rid of waste products? How do they get oxygen? How do they get nutrition? They do it because they're because of the first characteristic here, because they cover organs or they line body surfaces or the inside of organs. That would include blood vessels. So that means that, for example, blood vessels have blood actually flowing right past them, so they can exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide right there. They don't need another source of vascularity to perform that function. They line cavities and hollow organs. They make up glands. They have a free surface on the outside. That means they're exposed to some, usually some fluid of the body. They are also exposed to the outside of the body. Your epidermis is composed of epithelial tissue as well. But they usually have access to some sort of fluid, and that would be oxygen exchange and nutrient exchange. So they don't need to have a separate blood supply. Generally speaking, the cells divide readily. Injuries heal rapidly. They need that because they are exposed to the outside of the body, or they're exposed to flowing blood, or they're exposed to inside of the digestive system where there are nutrients that are flowing by. So they need to heal rapidly. Often these cells need to divide on a very regular basis. Cells are packed together. The cells are categorized by their shape and by their layering strategy. We're going to see that in a minute. Don't worry about these terms just yet. We'll get into that more specifically. All right. So if an epithelial tissue is defined as a simple tissue, that means it is one cell layer thick. Now it could have different shapes to that one cell layer, but simple means one cell layer. That means a layer of one of that kind of cell in a more or less flat surface. These cells are found always on a basement membrane. So a basement membrane is a connective tissue that is formed by connective tissue cells, which we will talk about in a moment. And a basement membrane is a floor, a place for that epithelial cell to hang onto, to grab onto, to give it some shape and continuity. It needs that. So, simple squamous. This term squamous. Squamous means flat. Flat cells allow the easy passing of, say, gases, so oxygen, carbon dioxide, the easy passing of nutrients. They're very thin. It allows, it creates a very, very a minimal barrier to the passage of gases or nutrients or waste products. So that's where you're going to find these kind of cells. You're going to find them in alveoli. Right? That's the inside of the lungs, flat. You want oxygen to go one way, carbon dioxide to go the other way. You don't want a lot of resistance. You want to make it easy. Thin, they are thin and delicate. They can be easily damaged. So they increase surface area and they increase the ability of substances to diffuse rapidly or filter rapidly. They are found on the inside of blood vessels. All of the blood and lymphatic vessels of your body are lined with a simple squamous epithelium. All right, the next shape, simple again, one cell layer thick, cuboidal. Cuboidal means shaped like a cube. So that means its dimensions are, it's about as tall as it is wide, as it is deep. Let's not get mathematical here. This is not a perfect cube. We're not talking about exact dimensions, but roughly these are cube-shaped cells. Kidney tubules, we find these a lot. Thyroid follicles are found, simple cuboidal. Simple, again, means one cell layer thick. Again, it will be on a basement membrane that is created by cells of the next type that we'll talk about, the connective tissue cells. Now, the next shape, again, simple. Simple means one cell layer. Okay, you got that. Columnar. Columnar means they are shaped like a column. These are tall and thin cells. These are found in the stomach, in the uterus, and in the intestines. Now, there's a little bit of a difference in these areas, and some of these cells will have what we call cilia. Now, cilia are a muscular connected tissue that can form a kind of a wave-like pattern, right? So these are muscular and they move in a coordinated pattern. There is another type of extension that comes out of a columnar cell that is called microvilli. Microvilli are simply there to increase surface area. They do not have a wave-like ability. They do not have the ability to move on their own. Cilia can move. They are powered by muscular type tissues. Microvilli do not move, and they are simply there to increase surface area. You'll see the difference in where these cells occur. Simple columnar cells with microvilli are found in the intestines. Absolutely. We want to increase the surface area of those cells so that we get better absorption of digested nutrients. Simple columnar cells, you'll see, when you see a micrograph, you'll see the nuclei of those cells will be roughly on the same level. So they're going to look like this. They're going to look tall, columns of cells, and the nuclei are about on the same level. Wherever that level is, they're about on the same level. I say that to contrast that to the next tissue. Pseudostratified columnar cells. Those nuclei will look like they're all over the place, right? So some will be low, some will be high, some will be low, some are in the middle, low, low, high, low. So we call these pseudostratified. Pseudo means fake or false. So a pseudonym is a false name. If you were trying to, avoid paying your taxes in the IRS, you might come up with a pseudonym, a fake name. Don't do that. They're going to find out. They're going to catch you. You're done. Don't do that, okay? But in this case, pseudostratified means that it looks like it's a layering effect of the columnar cells. But in fact, it's not layered. These cells are one cell layer thick, even though it looks like it's multi-layered. So we say that's pseudostratified. Pseudostratified columnar are almost always found in the respiratory system. And in addition, you're going to find that they have cilia on top of them. Now, cilia, again, are these muscular extensions uh, there are other cells, intervening cells, that will create mucus, and that mucus will lay on top of the cilia. Now, this makes sense in the respiratory system. When you breathe in, you're breathing in dust particles and dirt and whatever, and you don't even know you're breathing that stuff in. But that particulate matter gets caught on the mucus that is on top of the cilia, that is on top of the pseudostratified columnar cells. The muscular activity of the wave-like action of the cilia will bring that mucus either out your nose or down the esophagus into the stomach. Now, you will blow your nose and you'll get rid of that mucus so that it doesn't end up in your lungs. That's the point to this whole process. If you breathe in crap, it gets stuck on the mucus on the cilia. The cilia organize a way to propel that dirty mucus out your nose or down your esophagus into your stomach. You're going to get rid of that stuff, and it's not going to go in your lungs. And that's really the point here. So it's called pseudostratified columnar. All right, now, so we've gone through the one cell layer thick types of epithelial tissues. Next up are the multicellular layering effect of tissues, of the epithelial tissues. First type is stratified. So anytime you see stratified, that means there is a multiple layering effect of cells. They are stacked one on top of the other. Stratified squamous, still flat cells stacked on top of each other. Many cell layers thick. How many? Many, many. There is no particular number that is implied by stratified. Usually these form a protective layer. Say for your skin, for example, the epidermis of your skin, you're going to find many, many, many layers, 30, 40, 50 layers of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So they form a protective barrier. They push each cell layer, will push the next cell layer above it out and out of the way, and eventually the outer cell layers, and especially in your skin, these cell layers will be shed. So you are shedding skin all over the place. Not quite like a snake, but you're leaving evidence that you have been somewhere all over. Now, this kind of tissue can be keratinized or keratinized. Keratin is a protein that helps to make skin waterproof, or at least significantly water resistant. I mean, you're pretty waterproof. You're not absolutely waterproof, but you're pretty waterproof. And that is because of keratin. That would be on the epidermis, but there is plenty of stratified squamous epithelium that is not keratinized. So, for example, the oral cavity is not keratinized. The vagina has this kind of tissue. It is not keratinized. Anal canal is also not keratinized. However, the epidermis of your skin is keratinized. All right, next shape, cuboidal, right? Shaped like cubes. Stratified. Boom, we stack them on top of each other. Those are found in the mammary glands, sweat glands, salivary glands, pancreas. Here's a picture of that. So stratified just means, now in this case, stratified squamous, you're going to get many, many cell layers. You may get, like I said, in the epidermis, you're going to get 30, 40, maybe 50 layers. Stratified cuboidal is usually not as many layers. 2 or 3 layers is about all you're ever going to get in these stratified cuboidal tissues. Of course, you can have stratified columnar. These are fairly rare, not real common, but does happen. The male urethra and some of the ducts of exocrine glands will have stratified columnar. Now, it is true that stratified columnar will tend to have cuboidal cells at the bottom, and that's just because of the weight of the cells tends to push those deeper cell layers and forces them into a different kind of shape. So they often will have a cube-shaped layers as the deepest layer, but we still call these stratified columnar cells. Now, you can have a mixture. There's no reason that you can't have mixed cell types or mixed epithelial cell shapes. One of the best places to find this is going to be lining the urinary bladder, ureters, and parts of the urethra. Why is that? As you create urine in your kidneys will send the urine down to your urinary bladder. Well, you're making urine all the time. And so the urine, this fluid, is starting to fill up your urinary bladder. And your urinary bladder is doing a thing that we call distending. We call that distension. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. A transitional epithelium, we sometimes call this a uroepithelium because it's in the urinary system. That allows all these cell shapes to stretch and increase the volume of that cavity. And you need that. And so these tissue shapes will tend to be fairly dense and thick when there's not a lot of fluid in there. But as the fluid accumulates, it tends to thin out. And the different shapes allow that thinning of that tissue. So we call that a transitional epithelium. Now this is a chart right out of your book, comes straight out of your book to help you to organize your thoughts about epithelial tissue. So there's types of epithelium. They come in two varieties here. You can have simple epithelium, one cell layer, or stratified, lots of cell layers. You can have one cell layer of flat cells, one cell layer of cube-shaped cells, one cell layer of columnar cells that are actually columnar, or one cell layer of pseudostratified columnar. Okay, great. What if we stratify them? What if we make multiple layers? Again, you can have stratified squamous, like your skin, stratified cuboidal, like in, you saw other tissues that you can go back and look at, stratified columnar, or transitional, multiple kinds of cell shapes that are stacked on top of each other. In stratified squamous, we can either have keratinized tissue, superficial cells are dead, and that would be the epithelium, that would be your classic example. Or you can have non-keratinized. The superficial cells are living, like your esophagus, the anal canal, the vagina. You don't want keratinized tissues there. Okay. Glands, glandular epithelium. We're still talking about epithelial tissues. However, they can join together and form glands. A gland are cells that produce and secrete substances into ducts or into body fluids. Right? So these are cells, these are tissues that make products that can be secreted, and they have an effect on other tissues or other areas of the body. So there's two types. We can have two types of glandular epithelium, two types of glands, we call these. We can have endocrine glands or exocrine glands. And the definition of these things is the following. Exocrine secretes their product, whatever the product is, secretes it into a duct. A duct. A duct is a tube. So if you make a product and if you put it into a duct and it goes to some other location in the body, that's an exocrine gland by definition. Flip side of that is an endocrine gland. An endocrine gland will secrete whatever its product is. It secretes it directly into either the blood or into a tissue fluid. Directly, no duct. You got that? Exocrine glands have ducts. Endocrine glands do not have ducts. Now, exocrine glands can also be defined or subdivided into different categories here. We can have unicellular. That means one cell. One cell can do a particular thing. It can make a particular product, and it can secrete that product into a duct. Classic example of a unicellular exocrine gland is called a goblet cell. And I've already told you what the goblet cell does. You didn't know it was a goblet cell. I didn't tell you the name, but it secretes mucus. If it secretes mucus, it is called a goblet cell. You will find these in huge amounts in the respiratory system and in the gastrointestinal system. We'll talk about that when we get there. So they secrete mucus. Most exocrine glands are going to be multicellular. It means you're going to have lots of cells, right? Many, many cells. Classic examples are sweat glands, salivary glands. These are classic exocrine glands that produce a product, some product, and they put that product into a duct. And that duct takes the product to wherever it's going to go. Now, these come in different shapes, simple or compound glands. Now, this does not exactly fall in line with simple or compound epithelium. This is not simple or stratified. It doesn't quite work that way. I'll show you why. So, simple exocrine glands have one tube, and where it says secretory portion, that means this is the thing. These are the cells that are producing the product, whatever the product is. So if it's sweat, saliva, these are the cells that are producing that. They put that product into this tube, and the opening of any tube in your body is called a lumen. L-U-M-E-N, lumen. So the product goes into the lumen goes into a duct, the duct goes to wherever it's going to go to, the tissue surface. If it's a sweat gland, it's in your epidermis. The sweat makes its way up to the surface of your skin. That's where the duct goes. Now you can have just one little area that's producing this product. You can have several branched areas that are producing that product. You can have a coiled, tubular type. Sweat glands tend to be this kind of type of gland. Alveolar simply means that you have a bulged out area at the end. But these are all simple glands. They're not highly branched. They typically have just a few tubes that lead to the one exiting duct. Now compound just means we have a branching component to that duct. I'm not so interested that you know that you're able to determine the difference between, say, a simple gland and a compound gland. I'm just more interested that you understand that there's a secretory portion, there's a portion of that gland that produces whatever the product is. And that product ends up going through a tube, which is called a duct. And that's what defines an exocrine gland. So here we go, types of exocrine glands. This is just a summary chart of what we just went through. Now this is a picture out of your book showing the same thing, but also showing you where some of these glands are. Now, a simple gland that has the cells, the secretory cells, or secretory cells, if you prefer that pronunciation, secretory cells here, they're giving you an example of a salivary gland. All right, so you have a parotid gland that's right in front of your ear. You have other salivary glands that are under your mandible or under your tongue, and we'll talk about those more later. But they are of a type of gland called a merocrine gland. Merocrine. Merocrine means that the secretory portion makes some product, and then it sends it out of the cell into the duct, and the product goes through the duct to wherever it's going to go, right? So saliva. Saliva is produced by these cells. It is put into the ductwork, and the ductwork takes it to the inside of your mouth. All right, that's a merocrine gland. The cell remains intact, doesn't change. It just simply makes the thing that it's going to make, puts it into the duct, off it goes. Now, a different kind of gland is called an apocrine gland. An apocrine gland the cells themselves, parts of the cell itself actually pinches off. So the cell isn't just making something and spitting it out into the duct. Part of the cell itself actually buds off and becomes part of the secretion of that cell. So these are called apocrine glands. You can think of apocrine meaning the top portion, the apical portion of the cell actually buds off and it actually becomes a part of the secretion itself. So a mammary gland is a classic example of this. In a mammary gland, the cell itself remains intact. It doesn't change at all. In an apocrine gland, the top part of the cell actually becomes a part of the secretion. The rest of the cell remains behind and makes more of the secreted material. All right. The third kind is called a holocrine gland. Holocrine means the entire cell is actually the secretion. So you have lots and lots of cells. These epithelial cells are dividing like mad all the time. They are creating their product, but the product is the decomposition or the disintegration of the cell itself. The whole cell becomes the secretion. So a sebaceous gland, that's an oil gland around hair follicles. So that's why hair gets oily. The entire cell is disintegrating with its cell membrane, which is oily, and the products inside, all the proteins and everything that's inside, and the DNA and all that stuff. It all disintegrates and becomes the secretion. That is a secretion from a sebaceous gland. So the entire cell is a secretion in a holocrine gland. The merocrine gland, none of the cell becomes a part of the secretion. And in the middle is the apocrine gland, where the top part of the cell becomes a part of the secretion, but the rest of the cell stays behind and continues to do its thing. Here's just another picture of that. This is from another textbook that I have. Same deal. Here's a merocrine gland. It makes a secretion, sends it into the duct. The holocrine gland, the entire cell disintegrates and becomes the secretion. And in the middle is the apocrine gland, which is the top part of the cell. And here's a summary. Summary of epithelial tissues, the kind of shapes, their layering effect, a description of those, what's the function, why would it matter that some cells are flat, some cells are tall? It matters. Form follows function. All semester for the 2 courses, you're going to find form follows function. Function follows form all the time. Okay, that's epithelial tissues. We move on to connective tissues, the second type of tissue types. Connective tissues are, as advertised, they do what they say. They connect, right? They serve as connective devices. They serve as structural assistance devices. And in one aspect, they serve to connect the entire body together. And we'll see that in a moment. Right. So they bind structures together. They provide support and protection. They serve as a framework. Epithelial cells don't necessarily serve as a framework. They need a framework to operate on. The connective tissues provide that framework. They fill spaces, store fat, produce blood cells. Yes, the blood system, blood itself, all of the cells of blood and the contents of blood are considered part of the connective tissues. So if I show you a slide of red blood cells and I say, name the tissue type, I am not interested that you say, oh, these are red blood cells. I don't care. I asked you about the tissue type. The tissue type is connective tissue. They protect against infections. The blood system includes white blood cells, which are part of the immune system. That's an immune system. But the tissue type is connective tissue. And then they help to repair tissue damage. Now, there is I missed an A there, extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix is a connective type of tissue that is produced by certain cells, and that serves as a supportive and structural function. Now, it all depends on what that tissue or what that organ needs to do as to how structurally solid this or how structurally fluid the tissue is. So there are connective tissue cells that make the fluid inside your knees and your shoulders, right? There's a synovial fluid in there. There are also other connective tissues that bind together, bones together, that need strong structural support. So it all depends on what that tissue needs as to what the extracellular matrix will provide for that tissue. Now, in contrast to epithelial tissues, which have no blood supply, that's called avascular. The letter A combined with the word vascular. No blood supply. Most connective tissues have a terrific blood supply, or at least some blood supply. That's not absolutely true among all connective tissues, but generally speaking, there's a decent blood supply to most connective tissues in the body. And most of these cells can divide, but they don't have to. Epithelial cells almost always are very mitotically active. Connective tissues are a little bit less mitotically active. They can divide. Most of them can. All right, now you have fibers. So connective tissues, certain cells will make fibers. These fibers contain proteins, and the proteins, the contents of the proteins will determine how strong that tissue is. And of course, that's going to relate to function. So here we go again. The form of the protein connective tissues will determine the function of those tissues. So a lot of collagen. Collagen is a very powerful, very strong protein it has great tensile strength and flexibility. It's a little bit elastic. It can give a little bit. Tendons are made of a lot of collagen. Ligaments are made of a ton amount of collagen. So ligaments and tendons have a tiny little bit of elasticity. They can give a little, kind of like a really, really tight rubber band, but not much. Now, if I need more flexibility, I'm going to add these things called yellow fibers or elastic fibers. And as the name would imply, elastic, right? They're more elastic. So for example, your vocal cords, your ears, right? They're pretty flexible. They're going to have a little bit more of elastic tissue and a little bit less collagen. Right, so not as strong. Can stretch and return to the original shape. You bet. Ears, nose, vocal cords. Reticular fibers are very thin, very delicate. They perform a very light and delicate and airy kind of supportive structure, but they do allow a lot of movement. So like your spleen, your liver, there's a lot of reticular fibers in the dermis of your skin that allows your skin. I can move my skin around. I can pick it up. And it's a lot of that is due to reticular fibers and elastic fibers that are found in the dermis of the skin. We'll get to that when we get to skin. All right, so components of connective tissue. So there are two big things. We break down connective tissue into the cells. What kind of cells are there? Fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are your big cells that make most of the connective tissue, and the kind of connective tissue that we just talked about. The proteins that are included in that are often made by fibroblasts, but not exclusively. They're the big producer. Macrophages are blood cells that will devour foreign particles, right? To clear foreign particles from tissues by phagocytosis. Phagocytosis, phago means to eat. Cytosis is to engulf, and so they eat foreign particles. Mast cells release heparin and histamine. They're usually used for inflammatory response. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So that's the cell. Those are the cells that are part of the connective tissue. Extracellular matrix. We've already talked about that. There's collagen. There's elastic fibers. There's reticular fibers. Then there's stuff called ground substance. Ground substance is just this tough tissue that fills in spaces in between other cells or adheres structures together, and it can be made of fairly fluid. stuff if things need to move around a lot, or it can be composed of more dense fibers if necessary to keep things in place. All right, now we can categorize connective tissue. We have what is referred to as connective tissue proper. Now, connective tissue proper is what you will come to identify as connective tissue, as the real, I'm going to move myself here, the real structurally supportive tissue that holds things together, binds things together, allows certain kinds of movement. We can categorize these into two big categories. They're either loose or they're dense. And that's just structure. That's structurally in the way the proteins are arranged. They're either quite sort of a loose, relatively unorganized structure, or a very dense, much more organized and much stronger structure. And it depends on the tissues, depends on where these tissues are. This other category that we call specialized connective tissues, these are the kinds of things that you don't always associate with connective tissue. So blood, I've already told you that blood is a connective tissue. You might not necessarily think of that as connective tissue, but it is. Bone, that is connective tissue. So if I show you a picture of a bone, or if you get this in lab, if it says, tell me the tissue type is connective tissue. But the other kind of question you might get is, identify this specific structure. You might say, oh, this is compact bone, or this is trabecular bone, or something like that. So that's a specific categorization of that of that micrograph. You want to make sure you read the question carefully. If it says, name the tissue type is connective tissue. If I show you a picture of red blood cells, it's connective tissue. If I ask you, what is this tissue specifically, then you have to say, oh, it's red blood cells, white blood cells, or the kind of, neutrophil, lymphocyte, whatever. That's a specific kind of cell. I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but I find a lot of people want to be as specific as possible. When I ask you about tissue type, I'm talking about one of these four types. Okay. I'll move on from that. Okay, so as I said, the real tissue types, connective tissue that you may identify as connective tissue, areolar, exactly as the name. It's thin, it's delicate, it's airy, it has spaces. It is supportive, but it allows a lot of movement. Subcutaneous layers. In your dermis, you have a lot of areolar connective tissue. It allows, as I said, it allows that kind of movement. I'm picking my skin up and pushing it around and stuff. It's because it has this areolar connective tissue. Now you're going to find, if you have a scar in your body, try to pick that up and move it around. It won't move around as easily. It's because it has less areolar connective tissue. So it can't move around as easily as the rest of the skin around it. Adipose tissue, that's fat, right? That's what we call fat. So it's adipose tissue or adipose connective tissue. What you're going to see when you look at micrographs, you're going to see it looks like empty space. You're going to say, well, where is it? You are looking at it. There is so much adipose tissue, so much fat in this cell that it pushes the nucleus off to one side. It just smashes everything up against the inside of the cell membrane. Now you need fat. You gotta have fat. You gotta have fat around your eyes, around your kidneys, around your heart. You have to have some. It's a cushioning layer. Fills in spaces between muscles. You want enough, of course, but you don't want too much. Unfortunately, that's what happens as we age, we gain more of this stuff. Darn it. All right. Now, look at the term here. Dense, irregular. If it's dense, that means it's packed together pretty tightly. but it's irregular. It's not perfectly fluid and flowing. You can't follow, one strand to the next strand. So you're going to find, say, for example, and there's another part of the dermis of the skin that has dense, irregular connective tissue, along with the areolar connective tissue that you saw in the previous slide. So this does allow some movement, but it's pretty supportive. It's pretty strong, structurally strong. Elastic connective tissue allows, as it suggests, a lot of flexibility. They show you a picture here. They're showing you the aortic arch. That it's made of tons of elastic connective tissue because it has to put up with a lot of pressure. It has to be able to absorb that pressure. It increases its size, and then it can recoil back down to its original size. Elastic connective tissue will allow that kind of movement over and over again. Cartilage. Now, you've heard of cartilage? It's in between joints, it's in between bones. The ends of bones are lined with cartilage. Cartilage is made by chondrocytes. So osteocytes, because osteo is bone, osteocytes make bone. Chondrocytes make cartilage. These are the cells that make cartilage. They are found in lacunae. Lacunae are just tiny little homes that these chondrocytes make for themselves. They're small little carved out areas where they reside. Cartilage. Now, I've told you that most connective tissue has a pretty good blood supply. Cartilage is where we don't have very good blood supply. Cartilage, most of the joints in your body, the cartilage around those joints, have very poor blood supply, and they heal very slowly. And that's an unfortunate reality for damage done to, the internal parts of joints. They're covered by a perichondrium. This is similar to bone. We're going to talk about bone structure a little bit more thoroughly in a couple of chapters. But around the outside of bone is this stuff called periosteum. Well, around cartilage, there's also a perichondrium. It's a connective tissue that surrounds cartilage. There's three kinds of cartilage. We subdivide cartilage. Now, it's still a connective tissue. Cartilage is a specific kind of connective tissue made by chondrocytes, and it's three kinds of cartilage. Again, depending on the function. What does that cartilage have to do? All right, number one, hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage forms your ribs, which are mostly bone. Just before the ribs get to your sternum, there is a cartilaginous section. We call that costal cartilage. That kind of cartilage is called hyaline cartilage. It's relatively flexible, but it's not as flexible as the next type that we're going to get into. But it does allow strength, support, but it also allows the rib cage to expand and contract. It allows the rib cage to move. Bones alone wouldn't allow as much easy movement, and it would be harder to breathe. So hyaline cartilage allows the elasticity of the rib cage. But it's also structurally supportive. So, for example, it says respiratory passages. The bronchi are composed a lot of hyaline cartilage, which allows a structural support that doesn't collapse, but yet is flexible enough to allow an expansion and contraction of those tissues to a slight degree. Elastic cartilage, of course, is more flexible. So there are more elastic fibers. And as I told you, ears have a lot of elastic cartilage. Your larynx has a lot of elastic cartilage in it. Now we get to bone. So we've got these flexible tissues. Now we're going to get to bone, which is more rigid, tougher. Bone still does have some flexibility to it, right? It's not just a rough, tough rod of steel, in your leg or your arms. Bones are living tissue. They are pretty rigid, but they're also living and can be varied over time. They're composed of two components. We like to say that there is an inorganic or a mineral portion. That's mostly formed from calcium or calcium salts. Those calcium salts, the most dominant form of the calcium salt is something called hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite is formed from calcium and phosphorus in a specific chemical arrangement. That's the inorganic portion of a bone. That gives it its rigidity, its structural, but that all by itself would make bone quite inflexible. It would be easy to break. On the other hand, the collagen component allows a little bit of flexibility. So if you combine these things together, you get a very structurally solid kind of structure, I guess. But it's also flexible. It has enough flexibility to allow for movement or for bending without breaking. Now, blood, of course, forms a supportive structure. You already know that. Your skeleton. I'm sorry, did I say blood? I meant bone. Bone forms a supportive structure, of course. Protects vital structures, of course you know that. It's also the source of blood cells. Flat bones in particular are the place where bone marrow resides, and bone marrow is the source of blood cells. All the blood cells in your body are produced in there. So, bone does that. It is also a storehouse for calcium and phosphorus. And you need a ton of calcium. You're going to see there's all kinds of body biochemistry that goes on that requires calcium. Your bones are a storehouse for that. Obviously, they support muscles. Muscles are contractile tissues. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But if they contract, big deal. They have to be attached to something to pull on it. They're attached to bones predominantly. Bone cells are called osteocytes. I mentioned that before. Chondrocytes make cartilage. Osteocytes make bone. But they live in the same little house, the same little home that they carve out for themselves. They're called lacunae. So osteocytes live in lacunae, chondrocytes live in lacunae. Now there's two big types of bone. You subdivide bone into compact bone, that's very supportive, very structurally sound, solid, versus spongy bone. It's not at all spongy as you would imagine if you picked up a sponge and squished it. It's not like that. But it is airier. It has more surface area to it. It's lighter. We'll see pictures of that in a minute. Okay. Compact bone. Compact bone is formed into long channels or long cylindrical structures that are called osteons. These osteons are made in layers. So you have to imagine this column of support where there is a layer of crystalline and cartilaginous bone that is weaved together into very, very long columns. That's called an osteon. Now, one osteon, of course, is not very strong, but if I put an osteon next to another osteon, and another osteon, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and I put them together into larger units, suddenly I have this very strong columnar support from osteons. They are made in lamellae. So a lamellae means a ring-like structure. It's a structure where you build a small ring-like structure in one direction. You build a ring-like structure on the outside of that, and around the outside of that, and around the outside of that, and you just keep building them around each other. And those ring-like structures perform the supportive function of bone. And then you put lots of those structures next to each other. You'll see pictures of that, better pictures of that. So this structure, this is one osteon, that circular structure right there. Now here's another osteon right next to it. Here's another osteon right next to it. And you would have hundreds and hundreds of these things next to each other. Blood, of course, is formed by bone, red bone marrow. Blood's composed of several different kinds of cells, and when we talk about blood more specifically, we'll get into those cells and what they do. Of course, they transport things around the body, oxygen, carbon dioxide. They perform immune function. This is a connective tissue. So if I show you this picture on an exam, or if you're in lab and you see this and it says, what is this tissue type? You don't say red blood cell, you say connective tissue. Now it might say, what is this specific cell type? Then you're going to say, oh, a specific cell. Well, it's a red blood cell. All right. Just as we had for epithelial tissues, we have a chart. Okay. We're going to classify connective tissue. Now, connective tissue has a singular cellular or common cellular origin, and that is referred to as mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is this primordial early stage of connective tissue development. But then we get into the specific subtypes of connective tissue. So, as I showed you before, connective tissue proper, the stuff that you will associate as actual connective tissue. Right? We have loose connective tissue or dense connective tissue. We can have areolar, adipose, or reticular, and you can go back and review those. Or it can be dense. If it's dense, it's much more compact. The fibers are closer together. They're more structurally supportive. Dense regular, dense irregular, or elastic. Great, that's connective tissue proper. If we go way over here, fluid connective tissue, the stuff that you don't really think of as connective tissue, blood and lymph. Easy there. Now in the middle is, of course, connective tissue. Bone is connective tissue, cartilage connective tissue. You have different kinds of cartilage, hyaline, fiber cartilage, elastic cartilage. Bone, you have compact bone and spongy bone. So this is a nice way to organize those tissues into a chart-like form. It's right in your book. Again, tattoo this on your forearm and you're good to go. Another way, another look at a different chart for all of these different structures, all these different tissues. You know, what's their description, what's their function, and their location. And you can read through that chart. All right, so in the body, we organize things around different structures. We combine these tissues together, but we also have to have membranes. And membranes, in this case, we're not talking about a cell membrane. We're talking about, in this case, epithelial membranes composed of epithelial cells, but they're also composed of connective tissue that allows a structural support to the epithelial cells. These kinds of membranes are really important for either supportive. They serve a supportive structural role. They serve as a way to exchange nutrients and gases in the body, or they serve to allow one tissue to easily move past another tissue. We'll see. In fact, the first one, serous membranes, is that kind of tissue. These line body cavities. You have 3 serous membranes in your body. These line body cavities, they don't open to the outside of the body. These are tissues, they're connective tissue that covers organs, specific organs. You have the pericardium that covers the heart. You have the pleural lining that covers the lungs. and you have the peritoneal lining that covers the intestines. These are serous membranes. There's an inner layer of a serous membrane that is very closely adhered to the organ. So, for example, the pleural lining, the inner membrane, is very closely attached to the lung itself. That's called the visceral layer. We call that visceral pleura. On the outside of that is what is referred to as the parietal layer. This is true for those other serous membranes as well. Outside of that is the parietal layer. That's usually attached to, so in the case of the lung, the visceral layer is attached right to the lung itself. The parietal layer is attached to the inside of the rib cage. And these two layers are very, very close together. And they produce, inside there, they produce what's called a serous fluid. And the serous fluid is, the purpose for that is exactly this fourth point. Serous fluid is there for lubrication and reducing friction. Every time you breathe, those two layers have to slide past each other. When you breathe in, they slide in one direction. You breathe out, they slide in a different direction. Slide, 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 slide. That's what serous fluid provides. A very easy, very low friction surface. Makes it easy to breathe. You don't even notice it. That's the purpose of a serous membrane. That's the purpose around the heart. Your heart's pumping. It's moving all over the place. It needs to slip slide inside its serous membrane. Intestines, the same thing. You're eating stuff. Your intestines are moving around. You'll hear the gurgling. You'll feel things, gurgling around inside your guts. Peritoneum allows the intestines to slide very easily because it's a serous membrane with a serous fluid. All right, the next kind of membrane, mucous membranes. We've already talked actually about some mucous membranes. Your respiratory tract is lined with a mucous membrane. Your digestive system has a mucous membrane. Urinary system, reproductive tracts has an epithelium plus areolar connective tissue. So it's not quite as supportive, structurally supportive, but it allows a lot of movement. It allows for the movement, especially in the respiratory system. Those goblet cells secrete mucus. The cilia can move the mucus out of the respiratory lining. You also have in the digestive system, you have goblet cells that secrete mucus, but you do not have cilia. No cilia. Those are microvilli. They're different. Cutaneous membranes. Cutaneous means on the surface, on the body surface. This is a cutaneous membrane. Skin, epithelium. Right, so your skin is your cutaneous membrane. Now it is part of what we call the integumentary system. So the integumentary system and skin are not the same thing. Skin is a part of the integumentary system. There's much more to the integumentary system. Chapter 6, we'll get into that. And then synovial membranes. Synovial membranes are in between joints, in between bones, where a bone and a bone meet. There's going to be a synovial membrane in there that will secrete synovial fluid, which will allow a reduced friction for the movement of bones next to each other. So those are membrane types. Okay, moving on. Muscle. This is the third kind of tissue type, muscle tissue. You got three kinds of muscles. Generally speaking, muscles move other body parts. Right, so these are the tissues that can move bones around. They can move the intestines around. They can move blood around your body. It's the muscles. These are the active tissues that move things around your body. I guess I said that already. Huh? All right, three types. Skeletal muscle, that's the one you know and love the most. Right, I'm moving my fingers around, I'm moving my arms around. It's skeletal muscle that does that. They usually attach to bones, not always, but predominantly attached to bones. They're called striated. Striated means that they look like they have stripes to them. Cardiac muscle is also striated. So it's going to look like it has this stripy appearance. Voluntary. This is the only kind of muscle that is voluntary. That means you get to choose. I get to choose if I raise my arm up, if I raise this arm up, if I turn my head that way, turn my head that way. I get to choose to do that. You do not get to choose whether your heart beats or not. You can't say, yeah, I think I will decide not to have my heart beat right now. So that's called an involuntary muscle. Skeletal muscle is multinucleated. That means one cell, or what we call a fiber, a muscle fiber, will have multiple nuclei. There's a developmental reason for that. We'll talk about that when we get more specific into muscles. They're long cylindrical cells, and they're stimulated by nerve cells. Muscles do not do anything on their own. Muscles must be told what to do. So most of the time they're going to be told by nerves. The nerves in your body tell muscles what to do. They tell them to contract. They tell them to relax. Muscles just don't go off on their own and decide that they're going to do something. They wait for orders. The other two types, you have smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is not striated, whereas cardiac muscle is striated. So skeletal muscle is similar to cardiac muscle in that they are striated, but smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are similar in that they are involuntary. You can't choose to contract your heart. You can't choose to digest your food or make blood flow around. Cardiac muscle has a very important structure called an intercalated disc. And inside an intercalated disc, that contains gap junctions. And you got to refer back to gap junctions. That allows ions to transfer from one cell to the next cell. That's what allows cardiac muscle to have a coordinated contraction, is that inside the intercalated disc are gap junctions that allow one muscle cell to communicate with the next muscle cell so that it can coordinate contractions. This does not happen in skeletal muscle. This does not happen in smooth muscle. Finally, nervous tissue. This is the fourth of the tissue types. Nervous tissue comes in two flavors. You either have neurons. Neurons are the nerves that you're used to thinking about, right? They allow communication to go from one end of the nerve to the other end of the nerve to the next nerve cell in line. So they serve as a communicative role. Those are the neurons. Those are the kinds of nerves that you think about. But those neurons have to be supported. They have to be helped. They have to be provided with certain either structural support or nutritional support or other factors that go into neurons doing their job. Those cells are called neuroglia, or sometimes we just call those glial cells. So neuroglia, and there are several types of neuroglia, and we'll get to that when we talk about nerves more specifically. So there are neurons, and they are the cells that do the communicating, and there are neuroglia that serve to support and nourish neurons in their task. That's it for nervous tissue. Guess what? Here is the summary chart for muscle and nervous tissue. Remember, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. There are some similarities and differences between all of these different types of muscles. Nervous tissue has two kinds, neurons and neuroglia. Here is a picture right out of your book. Really like this picture. The purpose of this picture is to show you that of these four tissue types, they're showing you an organ, not an organ system. They're showing you an organ, the stomach. All right, let's take a little tiny piece out of the stomach. If we look at it on edge, we're going to see, and they have color-coded the kinds of tissues that are there. So this organ has all four tissue types represented in it somewhere. So, and they color-code it over here. Well, we have dense, irregular connective tissue. All right, that's connective tissue. We have a nerve plexus. Well, you got to have nerves telling the stomach how to contract or to move fluids around inside the stomach. Well, that's nervous tissue, right? We have muscles. We have several muscle layers, and the fact that the stomach is unique in that it has 3 layers of muscles. Well, that's muscular tissue. And the mucosa, the inside, the most superficial layer of cells is called mucosa. That is composed predominantly of epithelial tissue. So we have all 4 tissue types represented in this one organ. It's all necessary to have all 4 types. You cannot have a stomach without one of these kinds of tissues in there. But if I asked you, what kind of tissue is this? You say it's epithelial tissue. You don't have to tell me it's columnar epithelium or a simple columnar epithelium with a microvilli border or something like that. If I say, what tissue is this? This is epithelial tissue. What tissue is this? This is muscular tissue, etc. You get it. This is true for going to be all organs in the body are going to have all 4 tissue types represented to various degrees for their various purposes. And that's it. Right, so where am I? I'll make myself big. So that's chapter 5. That is corresponds to all the tissue types that can be represented, and all are represented in all organs of the body. You need to understand what an organ needs to do, or what that body system needs to do, in order to understand the kinds of connective tissues, or the kinds of epithelial tissues, or muscular tissues, or nervous tissues that may be a part of that organ system, or organ itself. But there are 4, and only 4, tissues: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, nervous tissue. That's it. All right, I'm done. Let me shut this off. Let me get this out to you. And join me for chapter 6, which will be the integumentary system. I'll put that up in the next few days.